On Station V9, a massive space station floating between the territories of different alien species, humans were still considered newcomers. The station served as a diplomatic hub, where different civilizations met to trade, negotiate, and learn from each other. Among the many species, the Xelari were one of the most respected, but also the most mysterious. Tall, elegant, and possessing incredible intelligence, they were known for their cold, serious nature. They never smiled, never laughed, and never showed emotions. And no one on the station was more serious than Commander Elira. Elira was a high-ranking Xelari officer responsible for overseeing the station's defense technology exchange program. Her face was always expressionless, her words precise and logical, and her posture perfectly rigid. Many species admired her discipline, but humans found her intimidating. That's when Jack Carter entered the picture. Jack was an engineer from Earth, sent to assist in the tech exchange. Unlike Elira, he was the complete opposite, easygoing, sarcastic, and always ready with a joke. He had a talent for fixing machines, but an even greater talent for making people laugh. However, his humor had never met an opponent like Elira. The first time they met, Jack had been assigned to adjust the Xelari defense matrix alongside her. The moment he saw her, he whistled. "Wow, you look like a statue that came to life." Elira blinked, not reacting at all. "Your statement is irrelevant." Jack smirked. "You say that now, but I bet I can make you laugh before this project is over." Elira stared at him, her crimson eyes unblinking. "That is impossible." Jack grinned. He loved a challenge. As the days passed, Jack worked side by side with Elira, throwing jokes, puns, and sarcastic comments whenever he could. Nothing worked. Knock-knock jokes. Elira ignored them. Funny stories. She analyzed them like a scientist, accidentally dropping a wrench and pretending it was planned. She barely blinked. Jack had never failed to make someone at least chuckle, but Elira was a fortress of seriousness. Still, he refused to give up. One evening, while checking the control panel, Jack noticed something interesting. Elira seemed tense. Her fingers moved faster than usual. Her breathing was slightly deeper. Was she stressed? Jack leaned against the console. "You know, Elira, humans have a way of dealing with stress." She didn't look at him. "Clarify." He smiled. "We laugh." Elira paused, then turned her head slightly. "Explain how laughter removes stress." Jack's grin widened. Now he had her attention, and he was going to use it. The days passed, and Jack found himself working more closely with Commander Elira than ever. The Xelari Defense Project was a complex system, and every small adjustment needed the cooperation of both human and alien engineers. But despite their shared goal, the silence between them was always thick. Jack knew Elira's reputation. She was the Xelari's finest officer, a symbol of order and discipline. She never lost focus, never showed weakness. Most people respected her, but Jack felt different. He saw something in Elira's rigidness, a challenge. He couldn't help it. He liked challenges. But even he had to admit, Elira was a tough nut to crack. One afternoon, as they worked on recalibrating the station's defense shields, Jack dropped a loose bolt onto the floor. Oops. He bent down to pick it up, making an exaggerated show of tripping over the console as he did so. "Looks like I'm just too coordinated." Elira didn't react. Jack laughed softly, then shrugged. "Guess you don't find it funny." Elira's voice was calm, unbothered. "Humor is unnecessary. It doesn't help us achieve our goals." Jack, not ready to give up, leaned against the wall and crossed his arms. "So, you never laugh? Not even when something ridiculous happens?" Elira looked at him for a moment, her eyes unwavering. "Laughter is a human distraction. It doesn't aid efficiency." Jack smirked. "Well, that's a boring way to live. If you ask me, humor keeps people sane, especially in places like this." Elira didn't reply immediately. She continued adjusting the settings on the console, but Jack noticed a small frown tugging at her lips. For the first time, he saw her hesitate. Jack decided to push a little further. You know, humans have this thing called sarcasm. It's a form of humor where we say the opposite of what we mean. Like, oh great, another 12-hour shift, just what I needed. He smiled and made the gesture of a dramatic sigh. Don't tell me you don't do that sometimes. Elira turned slightly, her gaze narrowing. Sarcasm is a distortion of truth. Jack chuckled. Maybe. But it's also pretty funny. He paused, his eyes glinting with a playful challenge. What's the worst thing that could happen if you laughed? You might find it fun. For a brief moment, Elira looked at him. Really looked at him. She stared for several seconds before turning her attention back to the control panel. But this time, her movements were a little slower, and there was a faint tension in the air. Jack felt something shift, something small but significant. He didn't push further. Instead, he let the silence hang for a moment. All right, he said, breaking the stillness. I'll leave you to your serious work, but you'll come around, Commander. I'll make you laugh yet. Elira didn't answer, but for the first time, Jack thought he saw a slight shift in her posture, a subtle change that made him think maybe, just maybe, she was starting to warm up. The challenge was still on. The next few days passed in a blur of activity, with Jack and Elira working side by side on the Solari defense matrix. The project was complex, and every mistake could lead to disastrous consequences. But Jack wasn't thinking about mistakes. He was focused on something else entirely, cracking Elira's serious demeanor. Though she continued to be focused and professional, Jack couldn't help but notice small signs that maybe, just maybe, he was making some progress. One evening, as they were deep into calibrating the station's energy shields, Jack decided to test the waters. He didn't speak directly at first, just hummed a little tune under his breath. It was a silly tune, something that humans often hummed when they were in a good mood. Elira didn't acknowledge it, but Jack noticed something strange. She didn't ignore it, either. Her movements were a bit slower, as if the tune had caused a brief moment of distraction. She glanced at him, just for a second, and then returned to her work. Jack decided to press on. He cleared his throat, and in his usual playful tone said, "Hey, Elira, why did the alien bring a pencil to the space station?" Elira didn't look up from her console. "I don't know." "Why?" Jack grinned. "Because he wanted to draw some attention." Elira's hand paused mid-motion. She didn't laugh, but the slightest twitch of her lips suggested something. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Jack's heart raced. Could this be it? Elira quickly resumed her task, her face once again serious. "Your joke is illogical." Jack's grin didn't fade. The logical, huh? Well, I'll keep that in mind. I'll have to make a joke with better logic next time. But Elira didn't respond, and the conversation shifted back to the work. Yet Jack couldn't help but feel a small victory. He decided to keep trying, though. It was clear that Elira wasn't completely immune to humor. She was just resistant. He knew he had to push a little further, but without crossing any boundaries. The next day, they were in the lab again, this time calibrating the station's communication system. Jack noticed a small error in the signal, a silly mistake he knew would cause a minor glitch. He couldn't resist. "Whoops," Jack said, tapping the console. "Looks like the system just had a brain freeze." Elira's eyes flicked up, but her face remained impassive. A brain freeze is a human phenomenon. It is not applicable to this system. Jack chuckled, knowing she didn't quite get it. Yeah, but if computers had brains, I bet they'd get them. This time, he didn't get a twitch, but Elira's eyes lingered on him for a moment longer than usual, and Jack couldn't help but think that, deep down, she might be getting curious. Maybe it wasn't just his jokes that were working, it was the persistence. Elira, though still a stone-faced enigma, was starting to crack, bit by bit. Jack wasn't giving up. He knew he was getting closer. A few more days passed, and Jack found himself becoming more familiar with Elira's routines. She worked with unmatched precision and discipline, but Jack noticed a change. There was something different in the way she interacted with him now. The silence between them wasn't as uncomfortable, and she seemed to be responding more to his attempts at humor, even if it was just with small glances or the occasional raised eyebrow. Jack wasn't sure if she was just trying to be polite or if, somehow, his jokes were finally making an impact. Either way, he was starting to see signs that his persistence might actually be working. One afternoon, while they were troubleshooting a power surge in the station's energy core, Jack dropped another joke into the conversation. "You know," he said, grinning, "I've been thinking, what if the Xelari are actually part octopus?" Elira raised an eyebrow, but didn't respond immediately. Jack pressed on. "I mean, you guys have 8 arms. That's gotta be a little suspicious, right?" Elira's gaze was cool, but she glanced at him for a moment, her face giving nothing away. "Your reasoning is flawed." Jack wasn't discouraged. "Flawed? Really? Maybe I should have been a scientist instead of an engineer." He leaned back and smirked. "But then again, I'd probably be too busy trying to figure out why octopuses are the best at escaping things." Elira's gaze lingered longer on him this time. There was still no laugh, but she didn't immediately dismiss him either. She tilted her head slightly, as if trying to figure out whether Jack was serious. For the first time, there was a hint of curiosity in her eyes. Just as Jack was about to try another joke, there was a loud alarm. The lights flickered, and the station's main console blinked with an urgent warning. "Emergency protocol activated," the system announced. Jack immediately turned toward the monitor, his previous humor forgotten as the alert demanded attention. Elira's expression hardened as she analyzed the situation. The warning indicated a potential breach in the station's outer defenses. It was a serious situation, one that required immediate action. They both sprang into action. Elira moved with efficiency, quickly issuing orders to her subordinates through the station's communication network. Jack followed her lead, focusing on stabilizing the station's energy supply. As they worked together, Jack couldn't help but notice the way Elira carried herself. Calm, collected, and incredibly focused. She was nothing like the serious officer who had barely acknowledged him when they first met. There was a new level of respect between them. And it wasn't just about the work anymore. Jack realized he had gained a small but significant place in Elira's world. But the emergency was far from over. Just when it seemed like they had contained the issue, an unexpected surge in the energy grid caused another alarm. The two of them were forced to work even faster. They barely exchanged words now, both of them consumed by the task at hand. In that moment, something strange happened. The tension of the situation made Jack realize that humor wasn't the only way to connect with Elira. Trust and teamwork, those were just as important. By the time they managed to stabilize the station's systems, the crisis had passed. The adrenaline started to wear off, and Jack finally allowed himself a breath of relief. Elira, still focused, gave him a quick glance. "You were useful." Jack smiled, though he knew better than to expect praise from her. "Thanks, Commander. I try my best." And for the first time in their time working together, Jack noticed a faint glimmer of approval in Elira's eyes. She didn't say it, but it was there. Jack couldn't help but feel that his jokes were no longer the only thing making a difference. Maybe, just maybe, the bond between them was beginning to form. "You said." The station had settled back into a routine after the emergency, but the tension between Jack and Elira was still palpable. Both of them were back at work, but now there was a new understanding between them. Elira still didn't show any signs of letting go of her serious demeanor, but Jack could tell that she was a little less rigid, a little more open. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make him think that maybe, just maybe, he was getting through to her. One evening, as the two of them were reviewing the final adjustments on the station's defense systems, Jack couldn't resist. He had spent the whole day fixing circuits and recalibrating energy flow, and now he needed a little distraction. He leaned against the console and looked at Alira. "Okay, here's a new one for you," he said, his voice light. "Why don't aliens ever use elevators?" Alira didn't look up from her work. "I don't know." "Why?" she asked, her tone still neutral. Jack grinned, happy to have her engage. "Because they always take the space stairs." Alira paused. For a brief second, she froze, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if processing the joke. Jack watched her closely, waiting for the usual lack of response. But then, something happened. A soft sound escaped from Alira's lips, a small, involuntary chuckle. It wasn't loud, and it wasn't a full laugh, but it was definitely something. Jack's heart skipped a beat. He had done it. Alira quickly straightened, her face immediately returning to its usual stone-like seriousness. "That is," she cleared her throat. "Illogical." Jack couldn't help himself. He burst out laughing, completely caught off guard by her reaction. "You actually laughed," he said, still grinning. "I can't believe it." Alira's face remained composed, but Jack could see a flicker of something behind her eyes, a brief moment of uncertainty. She didn't know how to deal with the situation. "Humor is," she trailed off, clearly uncomfortable. "It's unnecessary." Jack leaned in a little closer, still grinning from ear to ear. "You know, Alira, I think you just need to loosen up a bit." Who knew that the famous commander could laugh at a bad pun? Alira's eyes flicked toward him for a moment. She didn't respond, but Jack could tell that something had shifted. She wasn't as cold, not as distant as she used to be. Instead of her usual unapproachable demeanor, there was a flicker of something more, something that resembled curiosity. "That was a mistake," Alira said, her voice still steady. "I am in control of my emotions. That is not the purpose of humor." Jack, still in high spirits, winked at her. "Maybe not, but I think it's the purpose of life sometimes." Alira didn't reply, but Jack noticed that she didn't immediately dismiss him either. Her expression softened for a moment, just a fraction. It was as if she had allowed herself to consider something that she had always thought of as beneath her. The possibility that humor had a place, even in the rigid world of the Xilari. Jack felt like he had just won a small victory. Alira, the unshakable, the serious, the emotionless commander, had laughed. And though she tried to hide it, Jack could sense that a door had just opened. He wasn't done yet, though. There were more jokes to tell, more cracks to find. But this was a start, a real one. The days after Alira's first laugh were strange. On the surface, nothing had changed. They were still working together on the Xilari defense project, still facing long hours of technical adjustments and troubleshooting. But beneath the routine, Jack felt a shift. There was a subtle change in the way Alira interacted with him. She didn't talk much more than before, but now there were small cracks in her otherwise perfect facade. Jack didn't want to push her too hard, but he couldn't stop himself from testing the waters every chance he got. He would throw in the occasional joke, sometimes with little success, but other times he caught Alira's glance, a tiny flicker of curiosity behind her cool, calculating expression. One day, as they worked on a particularly difficult calibration of the station's main reactor, Jack noticed Alira was unusually quiet. Her fingers moved swiftly across the controls, but her face remained almost emotionless. Jack couldn't help but wonder if she was still thinking about the joke. He decided to take a risk. "Okay, Alira," Jack said, his voice light. "What's an alien's favorite type of music?" Alira didn't respond immediately. She didn't even look up. Jack pressed on, determined to see if he could get a reaction. "It's space jazz." "Get it? Space jazz." There was no response. Alira's expression didn't change. Jack was about to move on when, out of nowhere, a slight twitch appeared at the corner of Alira's mouth. It was barely noticeable, but Jack saw it. His heart skipped a beat. "Space jazz," she repeated, her voice colder than usual. Humor remains illogical. Jack smiled. He hadn't succeeded in making her laugh, but that twitch, that tiny shift, was enough to make him feel like he was getting closer. "Hey, I'll take whatever I can get," he said with a grin. "But seriously, you have to admit, that was at least a little clever." Elira didn't respond, but she didn't dismiss him either. She went back to the controls, but Jack caught a glimpse of something in her eyes. Maybe it was frustration, or maybe it was just confusion, but whatever it was, it meant progress. Over the next few days, Jack continued to find little ways to make her smile, even if she never actually laughed. He dropped more puns into their conversations, made fun of his own clumsy mistakes, and even started telling silly stories about life on Earth. But with each attempt, Elira grew more silent, more focused. Jack couldn't tell if it was because she was genuinely annoyed, or if she was simply struggling to understand why someone like him found humor so important. Still, Jack didn't stop. He couldn't. There was something compelling about her, something that made him want to reach that part of her that nobody else had ever seen. Then one night, the unexpected happened. Jack had just finished a long shift, and he was sitting in the common area, eating a quick meal. He hadn't seen Elira for hours. When she finally appeared, she was holding a data pad and walking toward him with purpose. "I have a question," she said, her voice cool as ever. "Shoot," Jack said, not sure what to expect. Elira looked at him, her eyes steady. "Why do humans feel the need to laugh?" Jack blinked, surprised by the sudden seriousness in her tone. "Well, it's how we release tension, Elira. It's how we connect with each other. It's a way to share a moment, even when things are tough." Elira tilted her head, clearly processing his words. "I see," she said, though her tone suggested she still didn't fully understand. Jack didn't press her further. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and smiled. "You know, Elira, if you ever do want to learn why laughter is so important to humans, you just have to ask. I'll teach you." Elira's gaze softened just slightly, but she said nothing. For the first time, Jack noticed that she wasn't rejecting him. She was simply trying to understand. Maybe, he thought, that was enough for now. Days passed after Jack's last attempt at explaining humor to Elira. She had remained quieter than usual, more focused on their work. Jack didn't know if it was because of their conversation or if she was just dealing with her usual responsibilities, but he couldn't help but feel a slight shift in the air when she was around. It was as though, for the first time, he had planted a small seed in her mind. But Jack's casual remarks and attempts at humor hadn't gone unnoticed by the auxiliary higher-ups. The auxiliary command valued discipline and efficiency above all else, and Elira's recent behavior had been under the microscope. To them, even a slight deviation from protocol could be seen as a weakness, especially in an officer of her rank. One evening, just as Jack was wrapping up his shift and preparing to head to the station's cafeteria, he received an unexpected message from Elira. It was short, simply stating that he should report to her office. Jack frowned. A meeting. He wondered what this could be about. When Jack arrived at Elira's office, he was met by the familiar coolness of her demeanor. Her usual stone-like expression was there, but there was something else, something that felt more formal than usual. Elira gestured for him to sit, her voice stern but not unkind. "Jack," she began, "the auxiliary command has noticed something. Unusual behavior, to be exact." Jack's stomach twisted slightly. He had a sinking feeling that this was related to the jokes he had been telling her. "Unusual behavior?" he asked, trying to keep his tone light. "Did they say I'm too funny for their liking?" Elira's gaze remained steady. "Not you. Me." She paused before continuing. "They've observed inconsistencies in my performance, and they believe that it is linked to human influence." Jack blinked, not entirely understanding. "Human influence? You mean my jokes?" Elira nodded. "Yes. They believe that your persistent humor is distracting me. They fear it could be undermining my discipline. Jack felt a knot form in his stomach. He had suspected that his jokes might be having some unintended effect, but he hadn't realized they would become a problem. He leaned forward, trying to meet Elira's gaze. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," he said earnestly. "I just wanted to help you lighten up, you know. You can't be serious all the time." Elira didn't respond immediately. She was silent, clearly thinking it over. "I understand," she said slowly. "But there are consequences when one does not follow protocol. I have always valued order and structure, and I believe that your humor may have compromised that." Jack sat back in his chair, feeling more uncomfortable now. "So, what happens now? Are you going to get reassigned or something?" Elira sighed deeply, her expression softening just a little. "I will be monitored closely, and if my performance continues to decline, there will be consequences. Perhaps reassignment will be necessary." Jack's mind raced. He hadn't expected things to go this far. His attempts at breaking Elira's seriousness had led to unintended consequences. He hadn't just made her laugh. He had somehow opened a chink in her armor, and now the higher-ups were worried that she was becoming too human. "Look," Jack said, trying to make light of the situation. "I don't want to get you in trouble. I'll tone down the jokes. No more puns or silly stuff." Elira didn't look convinced. "It's not just about jokes, Jack. It's about balance. I must find a way to remain focused without losing my discipline. Your humor has made me realize that there is more to life than just order, but I also need to understand how to control it." Jack nodded, understanding now that Elira wasn't blaming him. She was struggling to find equilibrium, to balance the seriousness of her role with the human side. She was beginning to understand. "I get it," Jack said quietly. "I won't push anymore. But maybe you don't have to completely shut out humor either. There's a middle ground, right?" Elira looked at him for a moment, her eyes thoughtful. "Perhaps there is," she replied. "But I will need time to adjust." Jack smiled softly. "I'll be here when you're ready, Commander." For the first time, Elira nodded, a slight acknowledgement of the connection that had formed between them. It wasn't much, but it was a step in the right direction. A small crack in the wall she had so carefully built around herself. And Jack knew that, no matter what happened next, he had made a difference. The days following Jack and Elira's conversation about humor were quieter, but the atmosphere between them had subtly shifted. Jack kept to his promise. He stopped pushing Elira with jokes, giving her the space she needed to process everything. But he still couldn't help noticing that, despite her attempts to maintain the rigid seriousness she was known for, Elira seemed a little more relaxed, a little less cold. There were still moments where she would catch him with a small comment, and Jack would smile at how much she was beginning to understand. But even with the slight changes, Elira remained reserved, focused on the mission ahead. One morning, the routine on Station V9 was disrupted by a sudden and unexpected call for an emergency meeting. The auxiliary leadership had scheduled an urgent assembly of all commanders and key officers, including Jack. Everyone was on high alert, their minds already focused on whatever the new crisis was. As they gathered in the briefing room, Jack noticed that Elira, who usually exuded calm confidence, now seemed slightly tense. Her normally steady posture had a slight edge to it, her eyes glancing quickly over the briefing materials, but her mind seemed somewhere else. When the doors closed, the auxiliary leader, a tall, imposing figure, addressed them. The topic was serious. A rival faction had breached their outer defenses, and their fleet was heading toward the station. Everyone was expected to prepare for battle. Jack could see that Elira was already deep in thought, analyzing the data as if she had already planned their next steps. But then, something unexpected happened. In the middle of the meeting, while the group discussed their options for defense, the mood shifted. A low hum from the station's speaker system broke the tense silence. The main communications officer appeared on the monitor, visibly rattled. "Commander Elira, there's something strange happening with our communications network." Elira's calm mask instantly slipped as she moved to the console, typing quickly to access the problem. She frowned. "It appears our systems are being tampered with." The room fell silent as everyone realized the gravity of the situation. A cyber attack from the rival faction had already begun, and if they didn't act fast, the entire station would be vulnerable. "Jack, I need you to help me with the communications," Elira said, her voice firm. She barely looked at him as she spoke, but there was an underlying urgency in her tone. Jack nodded immediately. They both knew that fixing this issue would require them to work quickly and precisely. They couldn't afford to waste time. As they worked side by side, their minds completely focused on the task at hand, Jack couldn't help but notice the change in Elira's demeanor. She was still serious, but she seemed more in control, more confident than ever. There was a certain strength in her presence now, a balance between her auxiliary discipline and the understanding of the human side of life that she had started to embrace. They worked through the communication issue with speed and efficiency, quickly rerouting the station's signal through emergency channels. In the middle of the chaos, Jack cracked a small joke, something about the system freaking out more than a human on a Monday morning. Elira didn't laugh, but this time she smiled, just slightly. The smile was small, but it was there, and for Jack, it was all the confirmation he needed. The communications were restored, and the immediate danger was avoided. They had won this round, but more challenges would come. As the crisis settled, Elira looked at Jack, her eyes no longer as cold and distant. "Thank you, Jack," she said. "Your help was invaluable." Jack grinned. "Anytime, Commander. I'll always be here when you need me." And for the first time, Elira didn't respond with just a nod. She looked at him and said, "You're more than just a human engineer, Jack." That simple statement, those few words, were the moment everything changed. Jack realized that despite their differences, they had found a way to understand each other, and that maybe laughter had played a role in it all. It wasn't just about jokes anymore. It was about trust, about finding a balance between discipline and humanity, between order and emotion. And with that, Jack knew that this was just the beginning of something much deeper between him and Elira. The days after the communications crisis were filled with a strange sense of calm. The immediate threat from the rival faction had been handled, and Station V9 was back on track. However, for Jack and Elira, something had shifted. Their work together had become more efficient, their interactions a little easier. It wasn't just about fixing problems anymore. It was about something more. Elira, the auxiliary officer known for her strict discipline, had become different. While she maintained her professional demeanor, Jack noticed that she wasn't as distant. She had allowed herself to show glimpses of her humanity, the smallest hints of a smile, a slight change in her tone when speaking to him, and the occasional small remark that felt more like a connection than a command. One day, as they were working on routine adjustments to the station's defense grid, Jack decided to test the waters again. He had noticed that, while Elira had become a little more comfortable around him, she still kept her emotions in check. Jack was determined to see if he could get her to let go of her serious shell, even just a little more. "All right, Commander," Jack said, leaning over a console. "I've got a good one for you today. Ready?" Elira didn't look up from her work, but she paused for a moment, as if weighing whether or not to respond. Finally, she glanced at him. "Go ahead," she said, her tone neutral but with a hint of curiosity in her voice. Jack smiled, feeling a small victory in her response. "Okay, here goes. Why did the alien refuse to play cards?" Elira raised an eyebrow, not sure where this was going. "Why?" Jack grinned. "Because he didn't want to deal with humans." For a moment, there was silence. Elira looked at him, her expression unchanged, but something was different this time. Jack could see it in her eyes. There was a spark, a brief flicker of something. A small chuckle escaped her lips. It wasn't loud, and it wasn't a full laugh, but it was a reaction, and Jack felt like he had just won a small battle. Elira quickly looked away, almost as if she were embarrassed. That was Unexpected, she said, still maintaining her composed voice. But Jack could hear the slight change in her tone. She was softening. "I'll take unexpected," Jack said with a grin, feeling a sense of accomplishment. "You know you're getting better at this humor thing, Commander." Elira didn't reply immediately. She just continued her work, but Jack noticed that this time she didn't seem as rigid. There was a slight shift in her posture, a subtle softness that hadn't been there before. She was no longer just the cold, disciplined officer. She was something more. After a few moments of silence, Elira spoke again. "Humor, it's not what I was trained for, but it does make things easier." Jack smiled. "That's the idea. It's about finding balance, right?" Elira nodded, her eyes meeting his for a brief moment. "Balance, yes. I think I'm starting to understand that." Jack felt a rush of satisfaction. The walls that Elira had built around herself were finally beginning to crumble, and even though he didn't know what the future held, Jack knew that their connection, however small, had made a difference. As they finished their work on the defense grid, Jack couldn't help but wonder how much further their partnership could go. They had come a long way from the serious, silent moments when they first met, and now Jack had the feeling that their journey together was only just beginning. Elira's smile, though fleeting, was a sign that things were changing, and Jack was determined to see it through. The weeks following their breakthrough felt like a new chapter for both Jack and Elira. While they continued to work together on Station V9, the atmosphere between them had shifted. No longer was it simply a partnership based on efficiency and duty. Now there was a deeper understanding between them. Elira, still the disciplined and focused commander, had started to accept that there was more to life than rules and regulations. Jack, for his part, had learned that humor wasn't just about making people laugh. It was a way to connect, to break barriers, and to help people see each other as equals, no matter their species or background. One afternoon, as Jack entered the main control room for another routine check, he noticed something that made him pause. Elira was at the center of the room, studying the set of complex data reports. But for the first time, she wasn't alone. The usual quiet hum of the station was filled with the sound of laughter. Laughter coming from Elira herself. At first, Jack couldn't believe his ears. He hadn't heard Elira laugh like that since their first encounter. It wasn't loud, and it wasn't something that would echo through the entire station, but it was genuine. It was the sound of someone who had allowed themselves to experience the joy of a moment, not just the weight of their responsibilities. Jack stepped inside, unable to hide his grin. "Did I just hear what I think I heard?" Elira turned, her face a little flushed, but she didn't hide her smile. "It seems so," she said, her voice less formal than usual. "I was reviewing some of your latest reports. They're surprisingly entertaining." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Entertaining? My reports?" Elira nodded, a small glint of amusement in her eyes. "They have humor, Jack. I did not expect that." Jack chuckled. "Well, I've been known to slip a funny line or two into my work, just to keep things interesting." Elira's smile deepened, and for the first time, Jack saw a shift in the way she looked at him. It wasn't just the commander he had worked with for weeks. It was someone who had come to trust him, someone who had opened up to him in ways that would have been impossible before. "I think I'm starting to understand why you value humor so much," Elira said softly. "It's not just a distraction. It's a way to bring people together, even when they are very different." Jack felt a warmth spread through him. He hadn't expected her to admit that so directly. He had always known that humor could break down walls, but to see Elira, the most serious person he had ever met, embrace it, it meant more than he could explain. "I'm glad you get it," Jack said. "It's about finding the balance, right? Between focus and lightness, between order and chaos." Elira nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Yes, balance. I'd spent most of my life focused on order, on doing things the right way. But now I see that there is more to life than just following the rules." Jack smiled, feeling a sense of satisfaction. He had made a difference in Elira's world, just by being himself, just by showing her that there was room for laughter even in the most serious situations. As they continued to work together, their conversations began to shift from the technical and logistical to more personal matters. They talked about their home worlds, their cultures, their experiences. Elira still kept much of her Silari reserve, but now there was a likeness to their interactions, a shared respect that went beyond just their professional roles. It was a new beginning for both of them. The bond they had built was fragile but strong, and neither Jack nor Elira knew exactly where it would lead. But they didn't need to know. They had found something more important: understanding and connection. As Jack finished his task and turned to leave, he glanced back at Elira. She was focused on the work, but now there was a peaceful air about her, one that hadn't been there before. "Elira," he said with a grin, "if you ever need more entertainment, you know where to find me." She looked up, a smile tugging at her lips. "I think I might take you up on that, Jack." And for the first time, Jack felt that they weren't just two people from different worlds. They were two people who had found a common ground, one laugh at a time.